In this unit, let's talk about immigration, in particular push and pull factors. A push factor is a social, political, or economic factor that will push people out of the space of origin. Examples of social push factors include racial persecution, religious persecution, lifestyle persecution, any kind of intolerance against a community. Yet another push factor could be natural disasters. For example, earthquakes, like the example of Haiti. Immigration into Tijuana from Haiti came as a result of earthquakes, famine, drought, hurricanes, any kind of disaster that would destabilize the economy. Let's now address the pull factors. The pull factors are also social, political, or economic in nature. An example of economic pull factor could be a good economy in the United States, growing industries in the United States, a vortex where people might be welcomed to work in certain sectors. A social pull factor in the United States could be a climate of political ambiance that is pro-immigrant, that is welcoming perhaps of refugees. A political climate that would be a good pull factor would be one where the current party might be pushing an agenda that is pro-immigration, for example, amnesty, or in general immigration reform. So all of these could become, again, pull factors. The establishment of a colonial labor system. In the last quarter of the 19th century, the United States underwent an economic transformation. It involved technological advancement, industrialization, energy sources, domestic and foreign capital, and urbanization. The American Southwest financial system shifted from a local plaza economy to national and international markets. What we see is economic development that took place in three main sectors: agribusiness, mining, and transportation. These three before mentioned industries require a large labor force. They're labor-intensive occupations. The growth of these industries came at a time when there were changes to the traditional labor forces in the United States. For example, the end of slavery in the South, but also a series of anti-Asian immigration policies, a painful part of our long history of labor discrimination. You might ask yourself, what does the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Gentleman's Act of 1907 have to do with Mexican immigration? It's really quite simple. As you curtail one labor force, a dependency will grow on another. As the American immigration policies targeted Chinese and Japanese immigrants who were instrumental in many sectors, the industries relied heavily on Mexican workers coming across the borders. We must also consider the fact that there were areas like Arizona and California where historically we didn't require a large labor force. But as we began to have mining in Arizona, for example, and agribusiness in California, larger labor forces were obviously needed. And little by little, they began to come from Mexico. For example, in 1887 we have the Dingley Tariff, which placed a taxation on foreign sugar. The idea behind this was to augment, to support the growth of the domestic sugar industry in the United States. Obviously, by placing a taxation on foreign sugar, the American sugar industry grew and became in need of labor, which came from across the border in Mexico. Yet another example is the 1902 Land Reclamation Act. The idea behind this was to trigger agricultural growth in the Southwest by bringing irrigation projects. Dams, for example, were part of this. As a result, you have a growth in agribusiness, farming in the American Southwest, which again in turn was in need of workers from across the border. Another example of the luring of the Mexican workers into the United States, in other words, a pull factor, is the 1917 immigration law. As we know, in the United States, we had many laws that were passed in the early 20th century that really intended to keep the country, if you will, primarily white European. The 1917 immigration law is interesting because we see this desire, since the law placed a taxation and placed literacy requirements on immigrants coming to the United States legally. Now, the problem here was that in 1917, of course, the United States is engaged in the First World War. And there were concerns that if people did not come across the border from Mexico to work in the United States, that this could impact the objective of victory. As a result, the law was tailored in 1917 so that Mexican immigrants did not have to pay a tax and did not have to pass a literacy examination. You have to ask yourselves, why is this the case? And the answer, of course, is that we needed to have those workers here from Mexico. Another example of a concrete pull factor in the early 20th century, which also shows dependency on Mexican labor, is the enganche system. The enganche system appears in Arizona in the early 20th century, primarily in the mining sector. American mining companies knew that across the border in Mexico, there were people who had been miners for generations, who had engineered, perfected techniques in mining. And so they were recruited to come across the border without any documentation to work in American companies. Recruiters, known as enganchadores, were sent across the border to recruit these workers and offer them, of course, opportunities in the United States. It is a very good example, not just of a pull factor, but again a beginning dependency on Mexican labor by American business sectors in the United States. You might find this interesting. In the early 20th century, there was an actual term used in public spaces called Mexican work. It referred to jobs that were done primarily by Mexican people. For example, jobs that were low paid, dangerous, with no upper mobility. Ask yourselves if today there could be jobs or industries, in fact, where mainly Mexican people work and could be called Mexican work. It's a good cause of reflection. For example, today, agriculture, childcare, the restaurant industry, construction, landscaping depend heavily on Mexican immigrants, again, legal or not. They're dependent heavily on this labor force. Perhaps the most classic example of a pull factor and dependency on Mexican labor is the controversial Bracero program that took place between 1942 and 1964. The program first thrown into effect at the beginning of the Second World War. The United States felt an immediate impact when it came to labor shortages at home and was in need of workers from across the border. The program was supposed to last only while the war lasted, but the war ended in 1945, and the Bracero program continued until 1964. By the end of the program, almost 5 million men had come from Mexico to work in the United States. There were several consequences to the Bracero program. One, for example, was that there was dependency by the growers in this country on Mexican labor. In fact, an appetite that has been there till the present. There were also changes, of course, demographically speaking. 5 million men coming to the United States. Eventually, many of them stayed behind and formed our colonias, our familias in the United States. Some returned to Mexico, impacting the Mexican economy. Now, part of the controversy behind the Bracero program was that there was abuse by the growers against the workers. Low wages, exploitation, long hours, often even violence. And that is why it has become a very controversial program in the history of U.S.-Mexican labor. Now let's discuss, why is Mexican labor so important today, and why was it so important 100 years ago, legal or not? One of the factors is that Mexican labor is low cost. Even today, for example, in California, the minimum wage is about $11 an hour, while in Tijuana, across the border, we're talking about $11, $12 in one day. You can also find in Mexico skilled and unskilled labor pools. If you go back to the previous industries we discussed, you might be able to determine that mining and transportation require skilled workers. Agriculture perhaps not as much, but still, the pools are there, skilled and unskilled. One also thing to consider is that the immigrant coming from Mexico was largely unorganized, not seeking to be members of unions. They were simply seeking jobs and opportunities. Lastly, and it must be said with a certain irony, Mexican labor was easily accessible and was right across the border. During the Second World War, for example, during the Bracero program, the United States required that Mexican workers could be anywhere 800 miles from the border within 48 hours. That is, being accessible. But the sad reality is that Mexican labor is also easily discarded. Once we no longer use it, we can throw it back across the border. For most Americans, immigration from Mexico is a contemporary issue. But in reality, there's been over 100 years of codependency, interdependency between American labor needs and Mexican labor pools. For example, let's talk about the current administration. Looking at NAFTA reform, immigration laws and policies, the wall, DACA, anti-refugees policies, all of that is impacting humanity throughout the world.